And without much ado, let me pass on the virtual stage to Hugh Montag from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who will be today's moderator. Hugh?
Thank you. The topics of today's sessions are strike while the iron is hot, optimal monetary policy with a nonlinear Phillips curve, and large shocks, networks, and state-dependent pricing. I'd like to offer thanks to Rafael Schönle at Brandeis University in CIBRA and Dominic Smith at the BLS for organizing this session. This webinar is going to be 45 minutes and will contain two presentations that will each be about 15 minutes. At the end, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio or video, but they are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. You can post these questions during the presentations already, and you don't have to wait until the end of the presentations. After both presenters have presented their papers, I will select questions that people submitted to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar. This webinar is also live streamed via the CIBRA YouTube channel, and it will be recorded and made available on the CIBRA website at www.cibra.org and the CIBRA YouTube channel after the fact. Finally, a quick disclaimer. Participation in a CIBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CIBRA or CIBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CIBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. Okay. Now, with that out of the way, first, I'd like Ernesto Paston, a senior economist at the Central Bank of Chile, is going to present "Strike While the Iron is Hot: Optimal Monetary Policy with a Nonlinear Phillips Curve." So, Ernesto, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So let me share my screen, and you tell me whether you.
We can see it.
It says full screen now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So there we go. Okay. So thank you very much, Hugh, for the introduction and the CIBRA Association for the invitation to present this paper. This is joint work with Peter Karady, Anton Nakov, Galo Nuño, and Dominic Thaler. And nothing that we say here necessarily reflects the views of the European Central Bank, the Bank of Spain, or the Central Bank of Chile. So the standard framework, the textbook framework for monetary policy analysis, is usually think about the book of Galli or the Woodford book. Is linear quadratic, meaning that it's meant to for situations where the deviations of inflation is not so much from the steady state, and features a Phillips curve, which is constructed, which characterizes the aggregate dynamics of inflation, and features a constant frequency of price changes. In situations where the deviation of inflation is large, for instance, in the recent inflation surge, we see that inflation, there is a big departure of inflation relative to trend inflation or to usual level of inflation. So the linear quadratic may not be, this is open a question whether linear quadratic setup is good enough for those type of situations. And second, typically, the increase in inflation is accompanied by a large increase in the frequency of price changes, which also violate an assumption made in the usual textbook analysis. There is also evidence that the frequency of price changes may be somewhat correlated to a steeper Phillips curve, as it has been documented recently for the inflation surge. So the question that we're posing in this paper is how different is optimal monetary policy in a fully nonlinear framework where frequency is allowed to endogenously vary. So what are we going to do? We're going to take an off-the-shelf Lucas model. In particular, we're going to focus mostly for illustration on the Golosov and Lucas model. And I'm going to have one slide for the Calvo Plus model. I'm going to be more precise about what the difference between the two models later. We're going to calibrate the model for the US, especially matching the frequency and size of frame changes documented in microdata. And we're going to perform positive analysis. We're going to document nonlinearities under assuming a Taylor rule. And then we're going to drop the Taylor rule and we're going to solve the fully nonlinear Ramsey problem over the sequence space under perfect foresight. This is a new algorithm. Typically, this type of problems are not been able to solve. And we have been able to do it, but the cost of doing that is basically we must do it under perfect foresight. And with the solution, we're going to characterize optimal policy in the long run, in the short run, and in response to shocks. So what are going to be the key results? On the positive analysis, we're going to get that the Menounos model is going to deliver a nonlinear Phillips curve. It's going to get steeper as shocks make frequency to increase. On the normative analysis, we're going to find that when cost-push shocks are small, basically it's the same thing as the standard linear quadratic setup. But when cost-push shocks are large, then the optimal policy advocates for more hawkish policy, meaning policy that lean more against inflation. And this is what we call a strike while the iron is hot. Additional results will be the divine coincidence, meaning the result that for productivity shocks, monetary policy should stabilize the price level. That's also going to be true in our setup, and that is going to be true for small shocks or large shocks. The optimal long-run inflation is going to be slightly positive, and that is going to come from the symmetry in the firm's objective function, and the typically timing consistency problem, where the monetary policy may have incentive to inflate the economy to generate an increase in activity, is also going to be there, but it's going to be weakened relative to the standard framework of Galí or Wood for assuming price stickiness a la carte. So let me jump straight to the model. I'm not going to do the literature review just for the sake of time. And in the model, basically, we're going to have households. It's going to be a pretty standard model, except for changing a few ingredients to make the model solvable as a Menounos model. So households are going to consume Dixie-Stiglitz baskets of goods. They're going to work and they're going to save. The per period utility of consumption is going to be log, and this utility of labor is linear. There are going to be infinite varieties of goods, and each variety is produced by a single firm. And with a linear technology on labor, that's also going to depend on productivity, aggregate productivity. Firms are going to face a fixed cost denominated in labor units, eta, to update their prices, and we're also going to assume there's going to be an employment subsidy that will allow to vary, and innovations to this subsidy are going to be interpreted as cost-push shocks. Something that we need to add in this type of models that is pretty common is that we need to add some idiosyncratic component, which in this case is going to be a idiosyncratic quality component that we're going to assume that is going to be random walk. And on the one hand, it's going to affect the consumption basket. So if quality is high, that means that variety contributes more to the consumption. But at the same time, also it's going to affect production in the sense that when quality is high, it's also more costly, more difficult to produce. We're going to add a Taylor rule for positive analysis only. And the type of shocks that we're going to look at, the aggregate productivity, monetary shocks for the positive section, and dispersion shocks are all going to be A and 1. So let me give you an intuitive preview, an intuitive sketch of the model. First, after observing shocks, firm I chooses at T whether to adjust prices and by how much. Since there is a fixed cost, the optimal pricing decision turned out to be an SS rule. So basically, and they're going to be endogenous. They're going to be idiosyncratic shocks, so therefore they're going to be an endogenous distribution of prices, or what we call price gaps. So this here we have a picture. This is going to be the distribution of price gap, which is not degenerate due to the idiosyncratic shocks. The center, the zero, is supposed to be the optimal reset price that a firm is going to set. So that there's going to be a difference between the actual price and the optimal reset price, which is going to be given by the distribution. And the firm is only going to decide to pay for the menu cost when the deviation between the actual price and the desired price is large enough. So there's going to be an area of inaction that is characterized here by the vertical dashed lines, and only in situations where the price gap is large enough in either of both sides, the firm is going to pay for the menu cost, in which case the output gap is going to return back to zero. So there are going to be distortions in this economy. First, there's going to be price dispersion, which is going to be inefficient. And second, there's going to be the menu cost. So firms have to waste some resources by paying the menu cost every time that they want to change their prices. That is different related to the standard Calvo assumption, where basically there is a probability of changing prices, but once a firm has an opportunity to change prices, price changes are for free. Something that's going to be in the background, there's going to be also market power, which is going to be another distortion that we're going to shut down in some part of the analysis, then we're going to turn it on later on, and monetary policy has to deal with them all. So what a shock is going to do here? A large aggregate shock means that there's going to be a translation of the whole distribution of price gaps. In this example, going downwards, in a way that, on the other hand, the thresholds of the area of inaction, they may be a little bit affected, but not so much, in such that a lot of firms, a lot of products become worthwhile to change their prices. So they're going to be endogenous, an increase in the frequency of price changes, which is going to give an additional flexibility related to the aggregate price level which is on the top of selection. Selection is a feature that shows up in this type of model related to Calvo. In the Calvo model, every firm, every product, regardless of how big is the price gaps, has the same probability to change prices. In this particular case, only those firms where the price gaps are large enough has a positive probability of change prices. And therefore, once price changes occur, they're typically large relative to the standard Calvo model, and that generates some sort of flexibility in price changes, which is what we call selection. So this is the full model. I'm not going to go equation by equation, but I just want to say three things. The first one is that we solve the fully nonlinear problem. There is no second-order approximation on the objective. The second one is that there is not a single equation that characterizes the Phillips curve. There is a set of equations that jointly characterize aggregate dynamics. So we talk about the Phillips curve in a relatively loose sense. And the third message is that we need to solve basically for this whole problem. We have an algorithm, and our plan is to post that algorithm online when we have it as a package. So I'm going to jump the calibration. I'm going to just tell you that the calibration is for the US. I'm going to go straight to the results. So the first one is a positive result. There is a nonlinear Phillips curve. So in this figure, we compare the solution for Calvo and for the menu cost under a Taylor rule, where on the x-axis we have the cumulative. So there are monetary policy shocks. We assume monetary policy shocks that basically agreed on monetary policy shocks that got increasing, both positive and negative, such that they generate the deviation of the output gap and also deviation of inflation. In the Calvo model, as expected, the relationship between the output gap and inflation is going to be a linear function, but for the menu cost model, is going to be basically nonlinear and actually bending backwards when the shocks are very, very large. When shocks are going to be small, meaning there's going to be a small deviation of the output gap and inflation, basically one line is on the top of the other. We need to say that this is not, strictly speaking, the Calvo model calibrated to the frequency of price changes, but as suggested by Auclair and co-authors, we have adjusted the Calvo parameter in order to match this extra effect of selection that I was talking before. The reason why there is nonlinearity is basically when shocks are large, such that inflation deviates from the steady-state level, there is also a large deviation of frequency related to the steady-state level, so going up by quite a lot. So let me go to the first normative result. So we just established that there is a nonlinear Phillips curve. And now we're going to characterize what is the optimal response to a cost-push shock. And we're going to show that in this model it's also going to be nonlinear. So in the textbook linear quadratic framework, basically typically we have a second order approximation subject to the Phillips curve. And something important to notice is that the price dispersion, the relationship between price dispersion and the square of inflation in this model depends on the elasticity of substitution across varieties in household preferences and depends on the slope of the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve, in turn, also depends on the slope of the Phillips curve. So these two terms cancel out in a way that the optimal policy under commitment is a price level targeting rule that depends on the price level, depends on output gap, and only depends on the elasticity substitution across varieties. It does not depend on the slope of the Phillips curve. So in non-menu cost model, for small cost push shocks, this is also going to be true. But for large cost push shocks, then we have the result that strike while the iron is hot. And let me show you again. This is assuming, in this case, cost push shocks that become, it's a greater cost push shock that become larger and larger. We have a straight line, which is basically the 1 over the epsilon, the elasticity substitution across varieties. The Calvo model is going to be slightly different, basically because we also solve it non-linearly. But basically for a small shock, the slope is the same, and also is the same for the menu cost model. However, when shocks are going to be large, meaning that there's a large deviation of output and inflation relative to the steady state, the optimal policy delivers much smaller inflation than the linear rule. And it's basically the nonlinearity is going to kick in for frequency going above 20%, which is in this calibration is inflation about 10%. So why is the optimal target rule S-shaped? First, we have an objective function that is nonlinear. And second, we have a sort of Phillips curve that is also nonlinear. So what we do here is basically we repeat the same exercise that we had before, but we add an extra line, which is the red dashed line, which is a menu cost model assuming a quadratic objective. And you can see that the nonlinearity that we find in the optimal targeting rule is very much the same that we find in the full model. So we conclude that most of the nonlinearity comes really from the Phillips curve. What about the Calvo Plus model? What's a Calvo Plus model? Imagine the same model that I showed you before, but now firms also have the opportunity to change prices for free a la Calvo. So we have the baseline model, which is the blue line. This is the slope of the Phillips curve, the same that we had before. And we have two versions of the Calvo Plus model. One that half of the price changes are due to Calvo, and another that 80% of the price changes are due to Calvo. And you can expect the slope, the nonlinearity start to kick in for much larger shocks. However, the optimal monetary policy rule in all three cases remains almost the same. Why? Because for small shocks, basically the slope of the Phillips curve doesn't matter. So all models basically behave very much like the Calvo model. And for large shocks, all extra price changes coming in the Calvo Plus model are basically due to firms paying for the menu cost. So in that situation, the Calvo Plus model behaves very much like the standard Golosov and Lucas model. Result 2, divine coincidence holds. What is the divine coincidence? This idea that by stabilizing the price level, monetary policy can recover the efficient allocation after a DFP, an aggregate productivity shock. That's also going to be true here, regardless whether shocks are going to be small or large. Result 3, we're going to find that the steady state runs inflation rate, so meaning that the optimal trend inflation is slightly positive in the standard model. In the standard linear quadratic model is basically 0. Why? Because in the linear quadratic model by construction, the objective function of the authority is going to be symmetric, and in this case, it's not going to be symmetric. In particular, negative price changes or deviations from the output gap deviations of the price gap, negative deviations of the price gap are going to be extremely harmful to firms. So by pushing the inflation rate a little bit above zero, basically monetary policy can economize on firms paying for the menu cost, and that prevents the waste of resources that firms have to incur by changing prices. The last result is that timing consistency. The standard timing consistency is weakened by endogenous frequency. What we have done in our analysis, we assume a subsidy on employment in a way that that in a steady state is going to eliminate the distortion coming from the market power of the firms. So what we do now is that we drop that steady state tax. Therefore, the output is inefficiently low, and monetary policy has incentive to produce an inflation surprise to stimulate activity. That is going to show up in the standard Calvo model, in the standard textbook analysis. It's also going to be true here, but it's going to be less strong. Why? Because when monetary policy wants to generate inflation surprise, in the standard model, frequency remains constant, but here frequency is going to increase. So the effect of that inflation surprise on activity is going to be mild. So just to conclude, we studied optimal policy in a menu cost model delivering a non-linear Phillips curve. Optimal response to small shocks is going to be similar to the standard setup, the standard textbook setup. But when cost push shocks are going to be large, basically our prescription is a strike while the iron is hot. Also, divine constant holds for efficient shocks, regardless whether they're small or large. Optimal long-run inflation is going to be near zero, although it's slightly positive, and timing consistency is going to be there, although weakened relative to the standard factor. Thank you so much.
Okay, and thank you. Next up is Michel Gacibe, junior researcher at CREI and affiliated professor of the Barcelona School of Economics. He will be presenting large shocks, networks, and state-dependent pricing.
Thanks so much to the organizers, to Rafael and Dominic, for this fantastic opportunity to present, and thanks so much to Hugh for chairing this session. So this is joint work with Anton Nakov, by the way, just like the previous paper, and the views here are not necessarily those of the ECB or the Eurosystem. All right, so recent events, as we know, have brought a lot of new evidence about both the drivers and the dynamics of inflation. So in particular, we've discovered that even in advanced economies, there could be large inflationary swings, not just in headline, but also in core inflation. We have also discovered that there could be fluctuations in the frequency of price adjustment, and Hugh's own work has shown that for the US, but we know that in other countries. And we have also discovered that sector-specific shocks could be major drivers of inflation, and of course, a prominent example of that are rising energy prices following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, these observations are very interesting and very instructive and sparked a lot of interest, but at the same time, they present a notable challenge for a standard New Keynesian paradigm for at least three reasons. So first, a New Keynesian Phillips curve in the textbook model by my colleague Jordi Galí would need implausibly large shocks to generate inflation of the magnitude of 10% or so. And there was a nice paper by Lullier and Phelan showing that recently. At the same time, when we start thinking about movements in the frequency of price adjustment, we need to deviate from the textbook Calvo model and go into the menu cost paradigm. And a fixed menu cost model can generate these increases in frequency, but at the cost of an implausibly steep New Keynesian Phillips curve. And now the third point presents an even bigger challenge in some sense, because all of the models that I've mentioned so far are single sector models, so that by construction cannot be any sector specific shocks. And to have a model that can have sector specific shocks with movements in frequency, you need to embed menu costs into a multi-sector model with input-output linkages that can make those shocks propagate. So in some sense, we work backwards in this paper. We first address directly point number 3. And as it turns out, that addressing point number 3 helps us resolve points number 1 and 2. So in particular, we will specifically develop a novel kind of model, a general equilibrium model with many sectors interconnected by networks, with state-dependent pricing, and that was solved fully nonlinearly. So that, in a sense, very mechanically and very directly addresses the shortcoming number 3. But as it turns out, once we build that kind of model, we can also jointly rationalize challenges 1 and 2. So in particular, the reason why that is happening is, as we show in the paper, the interaction of networks with state-dependent pricing in the nonlinear world creates a novel mechanism, cascades and anti-cascades, which helps resolve the issue about simultaneously matching the slope of the Phillips curve and generating large movements in frequency. Why is that happening? Is for the following reason. So first, we formally show that demand shocks in this model, for example, monetary shocks, would lead to very small movements in the extensive margin of price adjustments, so in the frequency relative to the known network benchmark, creating smaller movements in prices, and that we call pricing anti-cascades. And the reason behind that is very intuitive. So networks dampen desired price changes after demand shocks, because the nominal wage, which these demand shocks affect, only accounts for a fraction of the marginal cost, and hence for a fraction of optimal reset prices. And hence, these desired price movements are getting compressed, which means firms at the margin, ceteris paribus, are less willing to pay the cost of adjustment. Now, that's the theoretical anti-cascade mechanism. What this means quantitatively is that we get a global flattening of the Phillips curve, or in other words, even for very, very large demand, or in particular monetary shocks, there'll be a lot of non-neutrality, and the Phillips curve will be essentially globally flat, even in an economy that is fixed many costs, Golos of Lucas, as long as you have networks. That's the anti-cascade effect. Now, for supply shocks, either aggregate or sector specific, for example, TFP shocks, you get the exact opposite. So networks amplify the extensive marginal price adjustment, or in other words, to create pricing cascades. And the logic behind that, again, is very simple. So productivity shocks, they have a direct effect on the marginal cost. But on top of that, as long as you have networks, there's an indirect effect through prices of your suppliers. So for example, after a negative TFP shock, you get a direct increase in your marginal cost. But on top of that, the prices of your suppliers also go up, which means your marginal cost goes up by even more, your desired price change goes up by even more, and hence you get a bigger price gap, and on the margin, you're more willing to pay the main cost. Now, quantitatively, this means that you get big frequency increases and inflationary spirals following either aggregate or sector-specific supply shocks. Or in other words, you can rationalize these big increases in frequency. And all in all, this combination of cascades and anti-cascades helps us simultaneously and endogenously generate a very, very flat Phillips curve, just like in the data, all coming from demand shocks, while also giving us big inflationary spirals coming from supply shocks that are either aggregate and sector specific. And those inflationary spirals are going to be accompanied by big movements in the frequency of adjustment, just as we saw in the data. So that's the paper in a nutshell. Very briefly, let me whiz through the model. So the demand side is very standard. So log linear preferences of households with a cash and advance constraint, just like Golos of Lucas. So standard demand side. Then aggregate consumption is sort of a total of consumption of sector-specific varieties, and there are n sectors in the model. So there's the cars, the food, and so on. And then sectoral consumption is in turn an aggregator of a consumption of varieties of individual firms in those sectors, where the idiosyncratic quality shock is introduced just like in the previous paper by Ernesto. And that's really the idiosyncratic shock in this model. Now, the supply side is more interesting. So each firm in each sector has access to this Cobb-Douglas production technology, where, as you can see, you have this quality process which enters the production function and get this sector-specific productivity A, and then you get the labor input L and the intermediate inputs coming from other sectors of the economy, and the input-output structure is completely unrestricted. Now, crucially, this technology implies a marginal cost function, which once again is a function of both the idiosyncratic quality and sectoral productivity and the prices of the inputs, both the wage and the prices of intermediates. And this is really the marginal cost expression, what is ultimately driving the cascade and anti-cascade channel. So you can see that money supply in this economy affects the nominal wage, whereas productivities have this direct effect through A and the indirect effect through the prices of your suppliers. And the differential response of your marginal cost to demand and supply shocks is going to be creating this distinction between cascades and anti-cascades. So in price resetting is, again, just like in standard Golosov-Lucas type of setup. So there's a fixed menu cost, which will allow to be sector-specific kappa for adjusting prices. And just as a standard, we can write the value of a firm with the real price little p, and this Bellman form consisting of contemporaneous profits d tilde, and the continuation value, where as usual, with some endogenous probabilities, you do not adjust, in which case you get the value associated with the eroded real price. And if you do adjust with some endogenous probability, you will get the maximized value, net of the menu cost that you need to pay to be able to choose the price optimally. Now, in principle, this eta hazard function, so the probability of adjustment as a function of your real price, we could make that admit any form. So if that was a constant, that would be the Calver model. Here we opt for the most extreme case, for the Golosov-Lucas fixed menu cost model. So this eta is 1 if the gain from adjustment in terms of your value exceeds the menu cost, and it's 0 otherwise. But this setup could embed anything in between, Calver plus, smooth hazard, and so on. So we can throw in whatever you want, including Calver, by the way. So it's nested as a special case when it's a constant. That's the whole model. Now, let me briefly kind of whiz you through some of the analytic intuition in a simplified static setup. So imagine that we have no dynamics in the model. We fully discount the future, and we can just focus on the initial time period. So I can drop the time subscript. In this world, the gain from price adjustment is approximately quadratic in the price gap of any firm, where the price gap is the difference between the desired, the optimal reset price, and the actual price of the firm. Now, since we have Cobb-Douglas production, we can actually analytically solve for the desired price of any firm in a sector. So the desired price in real terms, normalized by money supply, is just 1 over your sectoral productivity times the weighted product of your suppliers' prices. And with that expression, you can clearly express analytically the price gap of any given firm. So the price gap has now 2 components. It has the standard Golosov-Lucas erosion component. So if you do not adjust your price, your real price would be eroded by the quality realization and by the money supply realization. But on top of that, it also has a distance to, if you will, the sectoral desired price, which comprises of the sectoral productivity and the average real price of your suppliers. So that second part, the sectoral optimal reset price, that's really the contribution of introducing networks to the price gap dynamics. And it's crucial for the cascades and anti-cascades effect that we're getting. So notice that in the last equation, the only idiosyncratic thing that is firm specific is that quality draw epsilon ij. So that epsilon draw ultimately pins down whether or not you choose to adjust the price. And in fact, given that we have this approximate expression for the adjustment gain, we can analytically solve for the inaction region. So what values of epsilon would imply adjustment and what values of epsilon would imply non-adjustment. And this is what we have here. That's the inaction region. And once again, so the inaction region is centered around the optimal reset price of that sector, plus or minus the menu cost. So in particular, if you have a monetary expansion, the inaction region gets shifted to the left, as would always be true in the Golosov-Lucas model, right? In other words, you need more extreme negative draws of quality to do not adjust after monetary expansion. But here, once you get networks, you get this additional effect that although you get the increase in the wage, right, the prices of your suppliers are not adjusting by as much as the wage, which kind of hampers or kind of prevents your optimal reset price from moving by as much, which means the inaction region is not getting shifted to the left by as much as it would do in the Golosov-Lucas model. In other words, you do not need as extreme of a draw of quality to not adjust. Or in other words, the probability that you draw an epsilon that would imply non-adjustment, holding everything else fixed, is larger in a network economy. And that's the anti-cascade effect formally. So holding everything else fixed, introducing production networks, implies that the idiosyncratic draws that you need to not adjust are not as extreme as without networks. Or in other words, you're more likely to choose non-adjustment, holding everything else fixed. Now, with productivity shocks, you get the exact opposite. So again, after a productivity decrease, for example, as before, you would get a leftward shift in the inaction region. So you need these more kind of extreme draws of idiosyncratic quality to imply non-adjustment. But with networks on top of the direct fall in productivity, the prices of your supply is also rising, which implies an even more radical shift of the inaction region. So you really, really need extreme draws of idiosyncratic quality to generate the non-adjustment decision. Or in other words, holding everything else fixed, adding production networks requires very, very extreme draws of idiosyncratic quality to generate non-adjustment. Or in other words, holding everything else fixed, adding networks increases the probability of adjustment for any firm in a sector. And that's the cascade effect. Now, just to give you simple examples for how this works, imagine I had a roundabout production economy, one sector with a loop. If you don't have networks, productivity and monetary shocks are isomorphic up to sign. And if you draw frequency response against shock size, they'll be exactly overlapping. That's the dashed line. Now, if you add a simple loop with firms trading with each other, you will suddenly get that productivity decreases generate very quick increases in frequency. That's the solid red line. Whereas the monetary expansions are not generating as big of an increase in frequency of adjustment. That's the solid blue line. Or in other words, you get the cascade effects for productivities and the anti-cascade effects for monetary shocks. Another simple example, imagine you had two sectors, one upstream sector, one downstream sector. So think of upstream sector as being oil or something, and downstream sectors are the cars that are selling cars to people. Now let me shock each of those sectors with a sector-specific productivity shock of the same size. You can see that whenever you shock the upstream sector, you're getting bigger increases in frequency than if you're shocking the downstream sector. And that's because the price of the downstream sector affects the marginal cost of the downstream sector, but not the other way around. And by the way, this is a very clear illustration of a failure of Hulton's theorem here. So the two sectors have the same size in equilibrium, yet shocking one of them delivers a bigger aggregate change. And that's the sense in which the position in the network matters over and above your size in this economy when it comes to frequency. And you can extend this logic to an N sector chain. And you can see that whenever you're shocking the more upstream sector, you're getting a bigger change in aggregate frequency, even though each of those individual sectors has the same size in equilibrium. Again, this is a complete failure of Hulton's logic, where clearly the position in the network matters over and above your size. Finally, let me briefly show you some quantitative results. So we estimate this model to match sector-specific pricing moments for the euro area. So in particular, we're using the Prisma data set published in AJ Macro as Gautier and co-authors, and we estimate the sector-specific menu costs and standard deviations of idiosyncratic quality to match sector by sector the average frequency and size of standard deviation of price changes. And then we calibrate the input-output structure to the euro area input-output structure from the world input-output tables. First, let me show you some simple results for monetary shock transmission in this economy. So first, on the left-hand side, we plot the response of aggregate frequency of price changes to monetary shocks of different sizes. So as you can see, in the economy without networks, that which is the blue line, frequency will be moving by a lot, right? So after a 10% increase in money supply, you get like a 45% increase in frequency. Now, as soon as you add networks holding fixed all the pricing moments, the movements in frequency are going to be much more modest. So this is the anti-cascade effect in action. So you really kill movements in frequency. And in particular, for these small monetary shock sizes, even in the Golosov-Lucas setup, you almost entirely kill movements in frequency, purely coming from the production network. And if you see what that implies for non-neutrality of aggregate GDP in response to monetary shocks of different sizes, you can see that after very big monetary shocks in the no-network economy, represented by the blue line, you get dying out response of GDP pretty quickly. Whereas in the economy with networks, which is the red line, non-neutrality persists for a lot longer. And just as a benchmark, the green line shows the response in the multi-sector Calva economy with networks, with the same frequencies and sizes of adjustment. And you can see that the Golosov-Lucas economy with networks stays pretty close to the Calva economy with networks, even for pretty large shocks. So that's the sense in which anti-cascades really generate this powerful addition in nonlinearity. Now, kind of an alternative way to look at the same question is to plot the fully nonlinear Phillips curves. So you can see that, again, in the economy without networks, which is the blue line, the Phillips curve is already pretty steep to begin with, and it bends backwards already pretty quickly, exactly by the logic explained by Ernesto in the previous presentation. Now, as soon as you add networks to the economy with the same pricing moments, with the same frequency and size of adjustment, you get essentially a flat, fully nonlinear Phillips curve. So networks generate this, what we call global flattening of the Phillips curve, such that even for very, very big cumulative output gaps, you're getting very little inflation. And again, for the reference, this kind of dotted green line is not the horizontal axis. That's the slope of the New Keynesian Phillips curve in the Calvo economy with networks. Again, with the same pricing moments. And you can see that the Golosov-Lucas economy with networks stays pretty close to the Calvo economy with networks, and very, very far from the Golosov-Lucas economy without networks. So that's the sense in which anti-cascades generating by networks generate this empirically plausible flat Phillips curve, even in the Golosov-Lucas economy. Aggregate TFP shocks. Now here we're getting the complete opposite. So if we plot the aggregate frequency response to aggregate TFP shocks of different sizes, you can see that in the economy without networks, represented by the blue line, if you get like a minus 10% TFP shock, you get like almost a 40% increase in frequency. Now, the same minus 10% TFP shock in the economy with networks would give almost an 80% increase in frequency. Or in other words, networks really amplify the change in frequency of adjustment in response to TFP shocks. And now this helps us generate some of these big inflationary increases that we've seen potentially accompanied by increases in frequency. So on the left-hand side, we show the impact response of aggregate CPI inflation to TFP shocks of different sizes. And you can see, for example, that after like a minus 10% aggregate TFP shock, you're getting pretty tiny inflation in the Calvo economy given by the green line. That's the sense in which with Calvo, you need humongous shocks to generate realistic changes in inflation. Now, in the Golosov-Lucas economy with networks, you need pretty tiny shocks, actually, to generate already, 10% annualized inflation. And as you increase the shock, you're getting this kind of spiraling up of inflation, which is driven almost entirely by the increases in frequency. So that's really the cascade effects in action. Now, to finish it off, let's look at sectoral TFP shocks. So what we plot here is the response of aggregate frequency of adjustment, net of own effect, to a sector-specific TFP shock. And in particular, we plot this net aggregate frequency increase against the supplier centrality of the sector that we're shocking. And you can see there's a clear positive relationship. So sectors that are more central, more important as suppliers to the rest of the economy, shocks to them are generating big frequency increases in the aggregate. Why? Because they're the ones that are affecting everyone else's marginal cost and hence optimal reset prices down the supply chain. And you can see that for some sectors, like chemical products or food and beverages, the increases in aggregate frequency are actually pretty substantial. So a minus 20% TFP shock to the chemical products industry generates a 2% increase in aggregate frequency of adjustment. And that's, by the way, excluding the own effect on the frequency of adjustment in the chemical products industry. Once you include that as well, this is closer to a 5% increase in aggregate frequency. So supply shocks to some very central sectors in the economy can generate increases in frequency in the aggregate, and hence also big aggregate inflation surges. That's the key message of this specific chart. And I think with that, I'll be concluding. So I've shown you a new model with many sectors interconnected by networks and state-dependent pricing that is solved fully nonlinearly. Crucially, the novel theoretical channel that the interaction of the three ingredients generates are these anti-cascades in pricing after demand shocks and cascade in pricing after supply shocks. And that combination of anti-cascades and cascades helps us simultaneously explain kind of the empirically flat New Keynesian Phillips curve in the aggregate, while at the same time generating big inflationary surges after reasonably sized supply shocks, which also have a clear structural interpretation as shocks to central sectors in the economy. And we're doing loads of extensions now. So endogenous policy in the cashless limit, alternative pricing models, Calvo Plus, and we're also trying to see if we just feed in observed shocks, whether we can explain both frequency and inflation in the Euro area or the US. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. We might have run over time a little bit, so we'll ask some questions and then wrap up. But first, Michelle, Ernesto, do you have any questions that you would like to ask the other person? You're both working on somewhat similar papers, and I just was curious if you thought anything when you were watching the other person's presentation.
Not me, so let me give room to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, if we're running out of time, also good to pass, give people a chance to ask.
Okay. So first, a question for Ernesto. Ernesto, could you explain briefly to the audience why the Phillips curve bends backwards after an inflection point? And then as a follow-up, I'm kind of curious if what the kind of asymptotic behavior would be for the Phillips curve if the inflation rate kept rising.
Okay. So imagine that shocks are super large, are so large that everyone in the economy adjusts. Then the effect of that shock on output gap is going to be zero. So that is what happening when there is this banding backwards. If the shocks are going to be very, very large, they're going to generate a huge effect on inflation. At some point, they're going to generate zero output gap. And that is actually the asymptotic result. Rafael was very nice that he wrote the questions for us. So I don't know whether I should go or wait for you.
Oh, I'll just pick out some questions and then yeah.
Okay.
Right. I guess Michelle, this is another Rafael question. Could you talk a little bit about how the wage setting is specified in the model and how indexation would affect the results?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. So actually, the model nests kind of rigidity in wage setting as well. So we allow for sticky wages already in the results that I showed you. In particular, we specify like an auxiliary sector, which we call the labor union, whose only job is to buy labor from people. And then other sectors buy labor from the labor union sector as an intermediate input. And then that labor union sector faces the same Golosov-Lucas menu cost problem as the rest of the sectors in the economy. And we estimate the menu cost and the idiosyncratic quality process for the firms in the labor union sector to match the observed frequency of wage changes and standard deviation of wage changes in the euro area. So in that sense, we estimate the kind of wage stickiness problem here. And by the way, we could easily allow for segmented labor market here and have end unions where each of them would be selling labor just to a specific sector. That could be done very painlessly. Now, in terms of indexation, I would imagine that would generate kind of less persistence in the wage setting process, which I think should weaken the anti-cascade effect, because one of the reasons why that frequency response in particular was very flat near the origin is that on top of everything, when you increase money supply, wages are not responding by that much because of wage stickiness. If you somehow could undo that, that will weaken the anti-cascade effect.
Okay, I think we have actually run out of time. So I'd like to thank our two speakers for coming to present. And I would also like to thank everyone in the audience for attending.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank